Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you all here this evening to the second lecture in the Vice-Chancellor's public lecture series. Throughout the rest of the year, a number of leading ANU academics will deliver topical and engaging public lectures under the VC's lecture series banner. I hope these lectures will assist in sharing the university's talent and hard work with the broader ACT community. In July, the next Vice-Chancellor's lecture will be presented by Professor Steve Dovers from the Fenner School of Environment and Society. I hope you all have an opportunity to attend that as well. People come from around Australia and indeed from the world to study at ANU, drawn by the world-class academics who teach and research here and the work that they produce. We already have a highly successful public lecture series that hosts distinguished visitors, including prominent academics, influential policymakers, politicians and authors. The point of the Vice-Chancellor's public lecture series is to feature the talent that is among us here at ANU. These lectures will be filmed and available for viewing on the university's YouTube channel, sharing the riches on display here with the national and international audience. This evening, I'm delighted that Professor Hugh White is presenting this lecture. Hugh is a Professor of Strategic Studies in the College of Asia and the Pacific, an ANU Public Policy Fellow and a Visiting Fellow at the Lowy Institute for International Policy. He has been a very active player in the Australian strategic and defence policy issues for more than 30 years, working as an intelligence analyst, a journalist, a ministerial advisor, a senior official, think tank analyst, and academic. Hugh has been described as Australia's most original and independent strategic analyst, and some of his career highlights include his role as senior advisor to then Defence Minister Kim Beazley and Prime Minister Bob Hawke. He was also Deputy Secretary for Strategy and Intelligence in the Department of Defence and the first Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. This evening, Hugh will discuss our relationship with Indonesia and how prepared are we to deal with our largest neighbour if and when it becomes wealthy and strong. Ladies and gentlemen, please join with me and welcome Professor Hugh White.
Well, thanks very much, Vice-Chancellor, for the very gracious introduction. I'm not actually sure that whoever described me as, well, people talking about strategic policymakers don't necessarily regard independence and originality as a compliment, but anyway, thank you very much. Thanks very much to Katrina and her team, and especially Catherine, for making this event happen. Thanks to you all for coming. Nice to see lots of old friendly faces, a bit disconcerting to see so many of them who know so much about Indonesia. And thanks very much to the Vice-Chancellor for his introduction. Obviously, this lecture is very much part of a broader set of initiatives that the VC's launched to revitalise ANU's role in the public and policy space, and I'm very privileged to be part of it in several ways, including in the invitation to accept this lecture. It's always worth remembering that ANU was established after the Second World War as Asia went through phenomenally complex changes, very much to provide Australian governments and the Australian community with a resource to get our heads around the immense challenges to us that were posed by this fantastically rapid and radical alteration in our strategic environment. And of all the changes that swept Asia in those post-war decades, none were more significant to Australia's future than the emergence on our northern doorstep, where before there'd been a vast and complex colonial empire of the Republic of Indonesia. And not surprisingly, before Indonesia quickly became a real focus for ANU's work, and ANU quickly became one of the world's great centres for the study of Indonesia and attracting a galaxy of talent. One of the stars in that galaxy, I just want to mention particularly, because it was there at the very beginning of my own introduction to Indonesia. One day in the late summer of 1966, pretty interesting time in Indonesian history, a bit less interesting in Melbourne, I filed, in my first year in high school, I filed into a class which I was told, and I'm sure accurately, was the first secondary school class in Bahasa Indonesia ever to be taught in Australia. It was taught by a remarkable bloke called Archie Crow. And the textbook that was sitting on our desk in that first lesson was an introduction to Bahasa Indonesia by Serumpayat and Mackie. Jamie Mackie, of course, was there at my very first introduction to Indonesian and remained the person who I think more than anybody else taught me something about the country he knew so much about and loved so well. And I'd just like to note my debt to him. Jamie, like many others of that great generation, that great galaxy, are no longer with us, but ANU is still very much a great centre for Indonesian studies, still a great galaxy of experts, and as I said, I'm a bit disconcerted at how many of them are here tonight. I'm not one of them. I'm not an expert on Indonesia. The focus of my work has always been on Australia, and my excuse for talking about Indonesia tonight is really that I'm not talking about Indonesia, I'm talking about Australia. I'm talking about how Australia should conceive our relationship with this remarkable country, which is rapidly becoming more remarkable still. Last year, Citibank produced a study of global economic predictions, trends. These things are pretty common, but this one caught my attention because it predicted that by 2040, Indonesia would be the fourth largest economy in the world. The league table would read China, United States, India, Indonesia. $14 trillion economy. Now, I'm no economist and I'm not in a position to judge the methodological rigour and robustness of this particular study. But I'm told by people who know more about this stuff than I do that it's at least a credible piece of work, that its conclusions at least cannot be dismissed, and that, of course, a number of other studies, though a bit less bullish than that, point us in very much the same direction. Last year, PricewaterhouseCoopers ranked Indonesia 8th in the world in 2050. Goldman Sachs' famous 2006 study, which in a sense started a lot of this work, ranked Indonesia 6th in 2050. So, by any standards, we should be expecting Indonesia to be a much bigger player in the regional economy and in the global economy than we've been used to in its previous history. But what's really striking is the comparison with Australia. Even on PricewaterhouseCoopers estimates, which are the most conservative, Australia's GDP in 2025 will be 63% of Indonesia's, and by 2050 only 42%. Goldman Sachs put Indonesia's GDP in 2050 around 3 times ours. And although the Citibank study didn't give an estimate for Australian GDP because we became too small in the comparison to be worth the computer time to do the sums, at 14 trillion, in the Indonesian economy on their estimate, it's a fair guess that their judgment is that it's going to be something like 4 times Australia's. Now, I'm in the defence business, so I'm used to long time frames. 2050 is not a long way away, neither is 2040. These predictions carry 2 very important messages for Australia. The first is that on any of these estimates, Indonesia will soon be a much richer country than we are, and soon enough to be very relevant to today's policy choices. And the second is that on the more bullish of them, Indonesia won't just be a good deal richer than Australia, it will be one of Asia's great powers, perhaps one of the world's great powers. Now, of course, they might be wrong. Such predictions often are. Indonesia has very deep problems, but it would be unwise to slide from recognising the possibility that they're wrong to assuming that they will be. Remember that only 5 years ago, a lot of people dismissed the idea that China would ever overtake the United States to become the largest economy in the world. And indeed, the reason why it would be sensible to operate on the assumption that these estimates will be right, at least in broad outline, is that the factors that are driving Indonesia's rise are essentially similar to the factors that are driving China's rise. That is, the remarkable effect of large populations on economic growth when per capita productivity converges, as is happening at the moment. I think it's simply prudent to take seriously the possibility that Citibank's projection will turn out to be right. And this is very hard for us to do because it requires us to overturn some very deep assumptions about Indonesia and about ourselves. It seems part of the natural order to us that Indonesia is a poor country and that we are a rich country. And we tend blithely to disregard evidence that this might change. And of course it already has. On PwC's figures, last year, Australia's GDP in PPP terms was only 84% of Indonesia's. It's already a substantially bigger economy than ours. And this matters to the future of our relationship with Indonesia because wealth is the deepest source of power. and wistful talk of soft power notwithstanding, if Indonesia's economy grows, it will become much more powerful in many other ways as well, play a much bigger role in Asia. And as the preponderance of power shifts from Australia to Indonesia, the bilateral relationship will change fundamentally. And so will Australia's political and strategic circumstances. It's worth reflecting that our outlook on the world from this continent has always been profoundly affected by a very simple fact that all our close neighbours have until now been poorer and weaker than we are. We have no experience of dealing with a neighbour that's equal in power to ours, let alone greater in power. And now we're going to have to get used to dealing with that. Dealing with an equal and before much longer, a much richer power and perhaps even a great power. We need to ask ourselves what kind of relationship we'll want to have with Indonesia when its economy is 2 or 3 or 4 times the size of ours, and what we can do now to start building it. Well, the best place to start thinking about that is to ask where we are today. And it's worth bearing in mind that the relationship between Australia and Indonesia will always be an unusually difficult one for a very simple reason, and that is that due to accidents of history, no two neighbouring have more dimensions of their national life than these two. History, geography, culture, religion, ethnography, economics, you name it. It's not that we don't have things in common, but we are very, very different countries. And that doesn't mean that the relationship's unmanageable, but it does mean we need to work really hard, much harder than other pairs of countries, to overcome those differences and make the relationship work. This is never, under any circumstances, a relationship to be taken for granted. And yet I would argue that is precisely what Australians and Australian governments have been doing about the relationship with Indonesia for the last 15 years. While the momentum of this economic transformation has been building up, we have been looking the other way. The present government's standard line, which they inherited from their predecessors, to be fair to them, is that the relationship has never been better. I think that is palpably untrue. You compare today's edgy, limited, issue-by-issue, transactional approach to managing relations with Indonesia with the sense of possibility and opportunity that characterised the relationship under Paul Keating. And you can't say it's never been better. Today's relationship is dominated by the management of a series of bilateral issues which are at best of third-order importance. People smuggling, live cattle exports, alleged drug offenders in Bali. We know this sort of thing. And what's interesting is that all of these issues are issues in which we demand things of Indonesia. How long is it since we offered Indonesia something in return? Indeed, can we think of anything that Indonesia wants in return that we could provide them? And what does that tell us? The government would reply that I'm being unfair, that the strength of the bilateral relationship is reflected in the impressive growth of institutionalised bilateral consultative forums, like the new 2+2 talks between defence and foreign ministers, the recently launched Australia-Indonesia dialogue, and the proposals for regular heads of government summits. I suspect there's much less to all of this than meets the eye. It's perfectly possible for very important people to meet and say nothing important to one another, and it happens very often. I think there's no evidence that these meetings are being used to do anything other than the routine exchanges of well-known views or the management of those third-order issues that I mentioned. There is no evidence that they've led to genuine personal or intellectual engagement. And how could there be? Otherwise, how could Australian ministers have just not told Indonesia about the decision to base US Marines at Darwin or the decision to cancel live cattle exports from Australia, if the kind of relationship that we're talking about was really taking place? And whilst Julia Gillard will bump into President Yudhoyono every few months at the round of summits that they both seem incessantly now to attend, in her 2 years as Prime Minister, she hasn't, so far as I can see, taken the time to make a proper bilateral visit to Jakarta. Indeed, and I stand to be corrected here because I can hardly believe it's true, but I can't see from the record that there's been a proper, full-scale, bilateral Australian Prime Ministerial visit to Indonesia, apart from Kevin Rudd's in 2008, since John Howard did it in 1996. That is a very long time between such occasions. Somehow, NATO summits always seem more important. Now, of course, people say, but what about the aid program? Part of our relationship with Indonesia is the aid program. It is, of course, the largest recipient of Australian aid, well over $500 million in last week's budget. And this is where Australians point when they want to show the strength of the relationship, and many see it as the key to the future relationship with Indonesia. In fact, in the debate before the last budget, leading up to the cuts that were eventually announced, a very common argument was that it's essential to keep the aid vote growing, particularly the aid vote to Indonesia growing, because that's the key to a good bilateral relationship with Indonesia in the future. I want to argue that that's a very deep mistake. The aid program has become a substitute for serious political and diplomatic engagement with our most important neighbour, but aid will never build the relationship that Australia needs over the next few decades. We seem to think that aid will make Indonesians grateful to us and willing to do what we want. That, I think, exaggerates the importance of aid and very seriously misunderstands the psychology of receiving charity and giving it. Of course, there are many desperately poor people in Indonesia. It's a very big population, so even a lot of economic growth leads a lot of people very poor. And they deserve and no doubt welcome our help. But direct humanitarian help is only a very small proportion of the aid program. Most of it goes on programs that are much broader and more structural in their intent. Programs in economic growth, education, civil society, justice and democracy, economic and public sector reform. I'm sure there's lots of merit in lots of those projects in themselves. But the idea that this kind of aid is the foundation of our future relationship with Indonesia is based on the story we tell ourselves that Indonesia needs our help to grow. Needs this kind of help to grow economically and develop politically. And there is simply no serious evidence that that's true, and there's simply no serious evidence that Indonesians think it's true. In fact, I think it's very unlikely to be true. I'm not saying those programs are worthless. I'm not actually anti-aid on principle. I just think we should be very careful about the assumption that Indonesia needs our help to succeed. It doesn't need our help or our advice to succeed. And we're kidding ourselves if we think otherwise. We're also kidding ourselves if we think their gratitude will do much, if anything, to shape our future relationship in our favour. For a very simple reason, nobody likes receiving charity. Because giving is always, among other things, an expression of power, and particularly that's true between states. Our aid to Indonesia frames the relationship in terms that we in Australia find agreeable. It is a relationship between a rich and powerful country and a poor and weak one. We like that, for obvious reasons. We can hardly expect Indonesia to like it, and I don't think they do. Indeed, it's hard to escape the thought that Indonesia is focusing more and more on aid to Indonesia as the image of a rich and powerful country helping a poor and weak one becomes more and more anachronistic. Now, aid, if it's well targeted, can do a lot to alleviate real suffering, and we should be proud to do that. But it will do nothing to help us build the relationship we are going to need when Indonesia is a great power. And finally, when we look at the present relationship, I think it's worth just looking back to the shadow of 1999. Few Australians realise how even among the many Indonesians who deplore what happened in East Timor are glad to see East Timor as an independent country and welcome its independence. Our role in the crisis of September 1999 remains a deep source of unease and suspicion. Now, we don't necessarily have to share that view. We don't have to agree with their interpretation of what goes on. But there is every reason for us to be very aware of it and to try to understand it, because it points to deeper fault lines in the relationship, which are going to become more and more significant to Australia as Indonesia becomes stronger and stronger. The best analysis of those fault lines was given, perhaps appropriately enough, by President Yudhoyono in a speech to the Australian Parliament in March 2010. This was a formal speech to a joint sitting of the Houses of Parliament, very sort of formal, sober occasion. He was welcomed to the Parliament, as is the tradition, by the then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, who gave a perfectly agreeable speech of routine boilerplate, congratulating both sides on what a terrific relationship they had. SBY replied with a speech of a completely different character. It was a sophisticated and sombre analysis of a relationship that he saw as being bedevilled by mistrust. We should not be complacent, SBY said. The worst step we can take is to take this partnership for granted. He was speaking, of course, in beautiful English. He spoke of the misperceptions that Indonesians and Australians have of one another. He said, I was taken aback when I learnt that in a recent Lowy Institute survey, 54% of Australian respondents doubted that Indonesia would act responsibly in its international relations. There are Australians who still see Indonesia as an authoritarian country, as a military dictatorship, as a hotbed of Islamic extremism, or even as an expansionist power. He acknowledged that Indonesians had distorted views of Australia too. In Indonesia, there are people who remain afflicted with Australiaphobia, those who believe that the notion of white Australia still persists, that Australia harbours ill intention towards Indonesia and is either sympathetic to or supports separatist elements in our country. But tellingly, the way his speech developed suggested that he himself was not sure that Indonesian suspicions of Australia's attitudes towards separatism were entirely unfounded. Why else would he have thought it necessary to say this? Indonesians are a proud people who cherish our national unity and territorial integrity above all else. Our nationalism is all about forging harmony and unity among our many ethnic and religious groups. That is why the success of peace and reconciliation in Aceh and Papua is not trivial, but a matter of national survival for us as Indonesians. We would like Australians to understand and appreciate that. And he reminded us why Indonesians suspect Australia of fostering separatism. There were periods, he said, when we were burdened by mistrust and suspicion at both ends. There were times when it felt like we were just reacting to events and were in a state of drift. There were moments when we felt as if our worlds were just too far apart. During the East Timor crisis in the late 1990s, our relations hit an all-time low. That's very sober stuff for a visiting head of state at a very formal occasion as an honoured guest of our Parliament. And the grace and charm of much else that he said makes it clear that SBY is no Australiaphobe himself, which only makes the sternness of his message all the starker. This is his interpretation of the state of the relationship we have with a country which is becoming so much stronger over the next few decades. We need to take that message very seriously and accept that some Indonesians, at least, do not trust us because they think we support separatism that threatens their immensely complex and diverse country. This is a pretty sobering message. Today's an anniversary. It's the 21st of May. 14 years ago, Suharto stepped down as the President of Indonesia and the remarkable process of Indonesia's democratic transformation began. This was indeed perhaps the swiftest and smoothest transition to democracy in history so far, and we in Australia have been immensely fortunate that things have worked out this way. There are a lot more worse scenarios possible for Indonesia's political trajectory after 21st of May 1998, which would have been disastrous for Indonesia, but also disastrous for Australia. We have been incredibly lucky at the remarkable thing that the people of Indonesia have achieved. And yet most Australians have simply taken this for granted, or indeed ignored it. As SBY said, to many of us, Indonesia is still the Indonesia of the New Order, or worse. And the only images that we have of post-New Order Indonesia are September 1999 and October 2002. So 14 years after Indonesia embarked on the road to democracy, our relations with Indonesia have hardly been changed at all by that remarkable transformation in the country itself. When I used to work on the Australian-Indonesian defence relationship back during the New Order, quite a difficult time, it struck me that we had all the foundations of quite a good relationship here, were it not for two very indigestible facts. First was that Indonesia was in effect a military dictatorship, and the second is that it was in such internationally contested occupation of East Timor. Both of those issues have now been resolved for a very long time, and yet the fundamental dynamics of the relationship has hardly changed. This is a fantastically wasted opportunity. We've allowed 14 years during which Indonesia has been transformed to zoom past. We're doing very little to take advantage of it. And in particular, I think the historians will argue we've wasted the presidency of SBY himself. In 2004 and again in 2009, the Indonesians elected a guy as president who was probably the most pro-Australian person who could ever be elected to that office in Indonesia. He understands us well, I think he genuinely sympathises with us, he communicates very well with us. And yet, as his remarks to Parliament show, he at least obviously thinks that we've made very little progress in the management of this relationship indeed in the time he's been in the job. And in many ways, many material ways, over the era since the end of the New Order, and indeed the era since SBY has been president, the relationship has gone backwards, symbolised perhaps most starkly by the decline in the study of Bahasa in our schools and universities. It does remind us that we remain curiously uncurious about this remarkable country right next door to us, which will do so much to shape our future. I'm tempted to think that, to partly at least blame the government's travel advisories for this. They were just lowered somewhat about 2 weeks ago, but they're still, well, hardly encouraging for young Australians to visit Indonesia, and indeed a major inhibition to young Australians visiting Indonesia. So we've got a hell of a long way to go from where we are now, with a relationship that I've argued is in very mediocre shape indeed, and has already missed some really critical opportunities to redesign a relationship that will work much better for us when Indonesia is not a poor, weak neighbour, but a rich and strong one. And just to start thinking about what that might mean, I want to focus briefly on the particular area of the relationship with which I'm most familiar, and that is a strategic relationship. It's the question of how Indonesia develops as a factor in Australia's strategic situation. It's a big subject, and I'm going to have to deal with it pretty sketchily. It's also a very sensitive subject. Indonesia has always, since it emerged as an independent state after the war, had a special place in Australian strategic thinking for one very simple reason. It's the only one of Australia's close neighbours with any significant strategic weight. Even as a poor country, its sheer scale meant that it had serious strategic weight. And that has made Indonesia strategically important to us in two distinct and equally important but contradictory ways. It is both the only one of our neighbours that can pose any serious military threat to Australia, and it's the only one that could be a really useful, strategically valuable ally to us. And as one of the great classic documents of Australian strategic planning in the late 1970s said, for that reason Indonesia will always have some of the characteristics, both of an asset and as a liability to Australia. And there's a tension, an ambivalence embedded in Australia's strategic attitudes towards Indonesia because of that simple fact. And it affects everything. Of course, in both of those respects, both as a potential threat and as a potential ally, Indonesia becomes more important to us as its power grows. Let's look at them in turn, though. The idea of Indonesia as a potential threat hove onto the horizon very early in the history of our relationship. Well within a decade of Indonesia's independence, Australia recognised the potential for conflict with Indonesia over issues where our interests clashed, and particularly in the archipelago to our north. A potential for Indonesia to build armed forces that could tax Australia's own capabilities because of its sheer scale. And the possibility that our own great and powerful friends might not be willing to come to our help if a conflict developed. That a conflict between Australia and Indonesia might not engage the interests of the great and powerful friends on which we depend so much. And that meant that as early as the late 1950s, Australian strategic policymakers recognised the need for Australia to be able to defend its interests in a conflict with Indonesia without relying on the combat force of its traditional allies. First time that Australia really started thinking about independent strategic capabilities was in relation to Indonesia. And out of that, of course, the idea of self-reliance was born. In the early 1960s, as Suharto embarked on a series of strategic adventures, some of which confronted Australia pretty directly, the Menzies government radically reshaped Australia's then armed forces. In a sense, almost created the foundation for the ADF we have today, specifically in response to that possibility of needing to undertake a conflict with Indonesia unsupported by allies. And even after the New Order brought new and very welcome stability to Indonesia's international relationships and to the quality of the bilateral relationship, really transformed the tone of the bilateral relationship. And even after the post-Vietnam order in the wider Asian region brought stability to the region as a whole, and our anxieties about Indonesia as a potential adversary reduced very significantly, the conflict with Indonesia nonetheless remained, through the 70s and 80s, the least incredible scenario for a military conflict and the half-acknowledged focus for much of our defence plan. Now, fortunately, conflict was avoided. We have so far managed most of the time, with a few bumps and hiccups, to manage the relationship pretty well. But we should not be too complacent about that for the reasons that SBY set out so clearly in his speech. And I would say, reflecting on my own experience, that no one who lived through September 1999 relatively close to the decision making here in Canberra, and as a very close observer, as closely as we could, of the decision making in Jakarta, can be under any illusion about the risks we faced then of a serious clash. The tone of SBY's remarks about that I quoted before absolutely ring a bell with me. And no one should be any doubt about the willingness of both sides to increase the risks in those circumstances by seeing the worst of the other. And no one should imagine that we should never see those same risks again over an issue like West Papua. And of course, the risks and the consequences of a clash will grow over coming decades as capabilities change. Because for a long time, the strategic relationship between Jakarta and Canberra has been stabilised by a fortuitous asymmetry in our capabilities. Indonesia has a very large army and very weak, or relatively weak, naval and air forces, while we have relatively strong naval and air forces and a very small army. So that means that their army is big enough to worry us, but their navy is too weak to get it here. And our navy could get our army to Indonesia, but the army is too small to worry the Indonesians if it got there. And this is quite nice, actually. This means there's a limit to how much damage we can do to one another. And that's actually, so we're sort of incapable of doing very much damage, and that has actually helped to preserve stability in the relationship. If we had more capacity to hurt one another, we would have been more suspicious of one another, and I think a number of crises would have been harder to manage. But of course, that may start to change as Indonesia's economy grows and it begins to take more heed of its strategic position in the more contested strategic environment of the Asian century. Because Indonesia's strategic geography is entirely maritime. It is the world's biggest archipelago. As Indonesia grows wealthier, as Asia becomes more complex, as Indonesia starts to express itself as a middle power and perhaps as a great power in Asia, it will build bigger air and maritime forces. I certainly would if I was them. I mean, it's an archipelago. And it's bound to give priority to expanding those air and naval forces over coming decades. We should in fact expect it to become a major air and naval power in Asia. And as that happens, it will of course become much harder for Australia to preserve that benign asymmetry that I talked about. Our army won't get much bigger. Their Navy and Air Force will. And that will change the strategic balance between us profoundly. Now, Australia could, with wise choices, easily maintain forces able to deny Indonesia the capacity to project substantial power against Australia, even as its air and maritime power grows. This is a question of the balance between sea and island sea control. Different story. But it's not very hard for Australia to get that right if we make the right choices. But we'd have to make the right choices, and those are not the choices about the kinds of defence capabilities that Australia is making today. And part of the art of getting those choices right is to build forces that combine the maximum ability to defend ourselves with the minimum suggestion of any intention to threaten Indonesia. And again, those are not the choices that Australia is making today. So we could make the choices to minimise the risks to the stability of the strategic relationship that arise from Indonesia's probable expanding air and maritime capabilities, but we'd have to get some things right which at the moment we're getting wrong. The second way in which Indonesia will be central to Australia's strategic future is the other side, the potential ally side. When we look beyond our own immediate neighbourhood, when we don't just look at Indonesia eyeball to eyeball as two countries, but see the pair of us in the broader setting of the Asia-Pacific and consider how that wider Asian strategic system works, it becomes clear that Indonesia is a major asset to Australia in helping to insulate us from the major powers to our north and west. Any country trying to project substantial conventional power towards Australia's continent must do so through bases in the archipelago to our north. Our security is therefore always dependent on keeping major powers out of this region. This is a very old precept in Australian strategic policy. This is what we tried to do unsuccessfully, and as it turned out, with the Singapore strategy and the defence of the Malay Barrier in the 1930s and the 1940s. And it's what we tried to do with rather more success through our forward defence strategy of the 1950s and 1960s. And in terms of what one might call Australia's permanent interests, it remains the case that Australia will be much more secure if the major Asian powers of Northeast and West Asia do not intrude into the maritime Southeast Asian archipelago to our north. Today, Indonesia, alone of the states in that archipelago, has the potential to preserve it from such intrusions. This means that, if as seems all too likely, Australia faces increasing rivalry and perhaps conflict between its major powers over the next few decades, we may well find ourselves relying on Indonesia's strength to keep those struggles at a safe distance from our shores. Moreover, we may well find that the best way to ensure our own security is to work with Indonesia to do that, a new form of forward defence. That idea has been implicit in some aspects of Australian strategic policy for quite a long time, and I think it was the underlying rationale for Paul Keating's proposal for a security treaty with Indonesia in the mid-1990s that produced the short-lived, ill-fated agreement to maintain security that was signed by Gareth Evans and Keating just before they lost office and was ripped up in the disaster of 1999. But this old idea, now as Asia's strategic rivalries intensify, has a new salience and urgency. At heart, the idea depends on a deep alignment of interest between Australia and Indonesia in relation to the rising power of China. Both of us want to avoid being dominated by China, so both of us want the US to stay engaged in Asia to help prevent that. But both of us want good relations with China too, and neither of us wants to be dragged into US-China rivalry unnecessarily by a US refusal to make any accommodation with China as China are very congruent. Now, it's worth noting that if American policy towards China continues along the lines set out by President Obama in his speech to Australia's Parliament last November, we may well find that Australia's interests in relation to China in future decades align more closely with Indonesia's than they do with America's. It's conceivable, much would have to change, but it's conceivable that a few decades from now, our relationship with Indonesia will be the most important strategic relationship we have. It might indeed be the only alternative we have to splendid isolation. And that tells you how much work we have to do to turn this relationship into a relationship which will do what Australia's going to need it to do with this powerful country in a few decades' time. So what should we do? Well, the scale of these strategic challenges, opportunities, imperatives gives some indication of how far short the present conduct of the relationship with Indonesia falls from what we need of it. So what should we do instead? 5 simple suggestions. First, give the relationship the priority it deserves in our foreign policy. Lots of interesting things out there in the world, lots of things you can write a press release about. The Arab Spring, events in Libya, NATO summits, Afghanistan, Security Council bid, the G20. None of these are insignificant. They all have their place, but they all pale into insignificance in terms of their impact on the lives of Australians in coming decades, beside the central importance to Australia's future of getting this single relationship right. So the first thing Australian governments need to do is just to identify and act on the principle that this is amongst the 2 or 3 most important things in Australian foreign policy and commit resources to it, including diplomatic resources. The number of political staff, our mission in Jakarta is huge, but the number of political staff, that is, diplomats assigned to actually undertaking interaction with Indonesia's political system and reporting on that political system, is somewhere around that many. And most of the time, of course, they're ducking out the airport to pick up the Minister for Tourism from South Australia, who's got a very important bilateral meeting somewhere on a golf course. There's a lot has been written very well about our diplomatic deficit, but nowhere is this more acute and significant than in Jakarta. Secondly, we need to refocus our engagement with Indonesia away from the third order issues people smuggling, so on. And we need to start focusing on a really serious dialogue with Indonesia on the first order issues, including some of the ones I've been touching on. And it's worth bearing in mind that before we can do that, before we can start talking to Jakarta, for example, about how we both approach the immense challenge of the rise of China, we must acknowledge to ourselves in Australia the scale of those challenges and what they mean to us. Simply chanting, we don't have to choose between a strong relationship with America and a strong relationship with China is not quite going to cut it if we want to have a serious discussion with Jakarta. The Asian Century White Paper provides a very important opportunity for that. Third, I think we should begin right now a gradual process, a gradual but firm process to de-emphasise aid in the relationship. Of course it's not going to disappear and it shouldn't disappear. But its role in the relationship should be de-emphasised, and I think it will be a good thing for the long-term funding trend to start going down now. And I've got an idea of what to spend the money on. Sending 10,000 young Australians a year to spend a year in Indonesia learning Bahasa, somewhat better, I hope, than I did from Suharto and Mackie. They could hardly do worse. 10,000 sounds like a lot of people, but if it costs $10,000 to send a young Australian to Indonesia for a year, then you send 10,000 for 100 million. And we've got an aid budget of 500 million. That's tons of money there. Now that would transform the relationship, if it was well done. Fourth, this is a minor hobby horse of mine, abolish the travel advisories as they now exist. They're totally bogus. They place the government in a false position, pretending it can give information it can't really give, and putting governments and the rest of us in a position where interaction with countries like Indonesia is harder than it ought to be. And it doesn't actually save many lives, if any. And finally, restore the political consensus here in home amongst Australian politicians and between the major parties in particular about the centrality of the relationship to Australia's future. Until 1998, both parties recognised that this relationship was too important to play politics with, and they conducted themselves accordingly. Since then, leaders from both sides have lacked the political courage to speak out in favour of the relationship in terms that do justice to the issues at stake for Australia. We will not get Indonesia right. We will not learn how to live effectively with a great power next door until someone starts to do that again. Thank you very much.
Bob Lowry, just to get you going, Hugh, with Indonesia becoming so powerful and being a democracy, why don't we take the New Zealand option and virtually not have a defence force?
That's a very big subject. It's a subject for a different lecture, but a very long lecture. I mean, just to be clear, that's what we are doing. I don't know whether you noticed. Just go back and look at the budget papers. But seriously, it's possible that Australia could decide that if Indonesia is big and strong, and if we are confident that Indonesia's interests are going to be closely aligned with ours, we could do that kind of free riding. Indonesia could be, for us, what we are to New Zealand. And one of the questions for Australia is whether we're happy to go that route. I think that's a genuine question for Australia. But I've got to say, my sense is that there would be big risks in that, including risks about whether or not our interests and Indonesia's did remain aligned, and risks about the character of the bilateral relationship. And so I would at least want to explore how much it would cost Australia to maintain what I call, as a piece of shorthand, the independent strategic weight of a middle power, so that we could both contribute to supporting Indonesia in its work in keeping this part of the world safe, so we could have an influence on how that was done and be a bit more confident that they actually succeeded, and also to protect us should relations with Indonesia go pear-shaped. Now, I don't think we can do that at 1.7% of GDP or whatever direction we're heading, and I'm sure we can't do it with a defence organisation that we all know and love. But I think we could do it as a country, and I think we ought to try.
Okay. Thanks very much, Hugh, for immensely refreshing and frank analysis of all this. But I wanted to follow a line similar to the previous question in a way. I was a bit surprised that in your very frank analysis, you still imagined a future in which Australia's fundamental need in its defence strategy was to balance the possibility of threats from Indonesia. It seems to me that those threats, I mean, like the previous week, are in reality extremely limited of any kind of invasion. I mean, I just find it something that we have progressed very much beyond. And Australia, it seems to me, needs to get beyond that. But I want to suggest there is a way in which Australia could do a lot of harm to Indonesia, and that's through a natural disaster. And I'm puzzled that Australia is so slow to respond to that option, given that Indonesia is the most active part of the Ring of Fire around the Pacific, that the two biggest volcanic eruptions of the last 500 years both occurred in Indonesia in the 19th century. If they occurred in the 21st century, they'd stop all air traffic out of Australia. I wonder how much of your defence budget could and should be creatively devoted to response to natural disaster.
Yeah. A very good and important question. Or two questions. There are two elements to it. The first is the question as to whether or not we haven't grown out of the thought of Indonesia as a threat. I've got to say, I never lie awake at night worrying that that Indonesia might actually invade Australia, so to speak, the way we did after 1788. And you know, there's an interesting story there about that. But I don't. That's not what I think is a risk. But Australia has never defined its strategic interests so narrowly, and we have shown ourselves willing to use armed force beyond our own territory. Sometimes rightly, I'm sure. But I don't think we can limit. We could declare as a self-denying ordinance, so to speak, that we would never use armed force in those ways. And you know, one of the options that would flow from Bob's option of taking the New Zealand approach is to say, okay, we're just not going to do that. But I think while Australia regards itself as having interests in beyond our own territory, the possibility that those interests will not coincide with Indonesia's is something that I think we need to take account of. And what strikes me about the message from SBY in Parliament, and what struck me about that speech was that it resonated so closely with my own experience, is that with all the best will in the world, and with all the rationality that we can bring to bear in quiet moments, when things get tough, when crises emerge, when we stop thinking with this part of the brain and start thinking with this part of the brain, and this part of the brain comes into action pretty early in a strategic crisis, and it doesn't just come into action in the actual fight, it comes into action in the cabinet room and in the parliament and on the talkback radio. These are, I don't think we can be so comfortable that this is a relationship we can manage so well that this is a risk we don't need to worry about. I do think we need to work much, much harder than we have to manage that risk down, but we have to recognise that we can't do that on our terms. It means compromising and accommodating Indonesia on things that a lot of Australians wouldn't want to accommodate Indonesia on. That's why this stuff is so hard, because we don't want to accommodate Indonesia on it. So actually, I think, yes, maybe, but boy, that's a big agenda. Second issue about disaster relief. Look, the problem with using armed forces for disaster relief is that disaster relief is very hard, but conflict is much, much harder. And so the forces, the kinds of capabilities, the kind of ships, for example, that you'd build to undertake disaster relief, or the way in which you train and equip personnel for disaster relief operations, demanding though it is not a tenth as demanding or a tenth as expensive as the expenditure you have to go through in order to prepare people for full-scale armed combat. Combat is the most demanding human activity there is, just about, which is one of the reasons why why it has such a big place in our culture. And so, you know, don't quote me on these numbers. Well, no. Anyway, here's a guess. These are not tender quality prices, but it's going to cost us $27 billion. It's going to cost us well over $1 billion each for each of our 27,000-tonne amphibious ships, which will be, I mean, very nice for disaster relief. But I reckon you could get equivalent disaster relief capabilities for $100 million a copy. So for the same sum of money, you either get 10 times as much disaster relief or the same amount of disaster relief for a tenth of the price, and you've got the rest to go on something else. The idea that you get something for nothing by building armed forces and then using them for disaster relief is half right. That is, if you really need them for military operations, then they're a cheap way of doing disaster relief. But you don't build armed forces to do disaster relief. If you want to build something to do disaster relief, you build them specifically for that task, and they'll be much, much cheaper. Not necessarily better, but much, much cheaper.
Much more helpful to others.
Absolutely. But in the end, this does get back to the point about whether in the end the best way for us to conceive our relationship with Indonesia is that of helping a country in trouble. You know, the previous speech, that SBY came here in 2005, probably about April 2005, not long after the tsunami, gave a very nice speech in the Great Hall at a parliamentary lunch, in which he gave the most gracious possible thanks to Australia for the help. It was just after the Nias helicopter crash when so many Australians had died, and he just did that perfectly. But then he had a second line that said, but don't think of Indonesia just as a weak country. Don't think of us just as a poor country, a country that needs help. It is all of those things, but it's also a great country and a big country and a country with a big future. Think of us in those terms as well, which is really just my message.
We've got a jumble of people up the back. I'm not quite sure we've got the optimal sequence, but first, and then we'll go to the row behind you after that.
Callum Whitford, you mentioned the asymmetries between the TNI and ADF. Do you see that being a positive or a negative factor in a future defence relationship?
Oh, I think it's distinctly positive in that it makes it much harder for us to get to one another, and therefore easier to avoid conflicts. It's not fail-safe. It's not that Indonesia lacks any air and maritime capability, and it's not that we lack any land capability. But if you compare it, for example, with what happens in a standard continental confrontation with two countries sharing a land border, then so there's the whole problem of crossing the sea doesn't arise, then the chances of border incidents are much higher. In a situation where you have two maritime powers, both of them with very substantial capabilities, the chances of sort of incidents at sea, as the diplomats call them, are much higher. But where you've got a very big land power on the one hand and a very substantial maritime power on the other, they don't really occupy the same strategic or even operational space, and so the scope for interaction is that much lower, and that's a good thing in that respect, not a bad thing. So I actually think it's quite beneficial, and one of the points I was suggesting is that asymmetry will erode as Indonesia's power grows, because Indonesia will, I'm sure as I can be of such things, it will invest in air and maritime capabilities. I don't think it can be the world's biggest archipelago in the world's most complex maritime strategic environment without spending a lot of money on air and maritime capabilities. And so as that happens, the asymmetry will decline, and we will both be, if Australia stays in the game, substantial maritime powers. We'll have to manage their maritime relationship very carefully. It's not to say that I think Indonesia will all of a sudden have the capacity to invade us. I think, as I said, we can manage that risk pretty well if we buy the right stuff, if we don't waste too much money building big amphibious ships and one thing or another. But if we spend our money wisely, I think we can manage that problem. But we will still face the issue that we're both occupying the same strategic and operational space more than we used to, which carries greater risks.
Alex, I'm watching the clock. I'm going to get told to wind this up soon. I've got a few more questions to squeeze in. Yes, sir.
Ray from APCD. Professor, you mentioned earlier about the perceived Australian support of the separatist movements in Indonesia as a major factor behind Indonesian suspicions of Australia. I'm just wondering, in your opinion, is there anything Australia can do with regards to that particular issue? And also, how do you envision Australia's role in the coming decades with regards to like Papua independent movement? Thank you.
Yeah, look, it's a really important and I think actually a very critical issue. Because, you know, here Australian policy faces two very directly conflicting imperatives. The first is a clear and legitimate concern for the abuse of human rights in parts of Indonesia still. The second is a very important concern with maintaining a good bilateral relationship with a very important and very powerful country. And it's not as though that's a choice between values. There are values at stake on both sides. It's not as though our interest in a stable and peaceful relationship with Indonesia is just an interest and all the values are on the other side of the ledger in our concern for human rights, because peace is a value too. And there's a real moral imperative to try and manage the relationship with Indonesia in such a way that minimises the risk of conflict. And I think what SBY was telling us when he spoke in Parliament is this is not something for us to be taken for granted. He did it very graciously, but he did it nonetheless. So this is a very difficult question. I would say that the approach to take to it is to continue to make what you might call, proper, well-modulated representations and do what you can to press the Indonesian government to manage these issues, human rights issues, as well as possible. I have no problem with that. But that has to be accompanied with a really compelling argument in favour of maintaining the territorial integrity of Indonesia itself. Now that is a tough call. But I've got to say, I think there's a very distinct argument to be made, which I don't think we should dodge, about whether, for example, people in West Papua would actually be better off in an independent West Papua or as part of Indonesia. And I don't think that's a debate we should dodge. I think it's a debate we should have. I personally think the chances of them being better off, not under the present situation, because I do think the situation in West Papua at the moment is pretty dire, but if that issue can be resolved, I think the chances of them being better off within Indonesia are quite high. That's an issue that Australia needs to, I think, genuinely engage in. So I think it's an issue we shouldn't walk away from. We should walk right up to, but we should walk right up to both sides of it.
If since Indonesia is on the well process of becoming a rich country, so should we reduce the volume of Australian aid to Indonesia? Because if the objective of aid is to reduce poverty, then maybe you can divert those resources into other less developed countries. But more objective of foreign aid is to covering other areas. So many major countries are using the foreign aid as an important foreign policy tool.
Yeah.
So such as Japan and Korea also pouring money into Indonesia to accommodate their own national interests. So even though Indonesia is on the well process of becoming a rich country, we could use Australian aid as a policy tool to accommodate some strategic interest of Australia. What do you think?
Well, I think it's a very critical question. There's a lot of parts to it. I think there will remain for a long time to come a legitimate role for Australian aid in Indonesia. In particular, I think aid has a real place in situations of genuine deprivation. And there are a lot of people in Indonesia who remain very poor and who badly need help. But that's actually not what most aid is about these days. Most aid is about trying to make a bigger structural difference to the way a country runs with the aim of driving its economic development. And I have a deep scepticism, which I debate at length with my many friends in the aid community, about whether aid actually makes much difference to those deeper long-term economic growth. I don't think aid eradicates poverty. I think it can, if it's well used, alleviate the consequences of poverty for a while. And I think, to the extent that we should do that, but we should do that for straight, charitable, humanitarian, philanthropic reasons. We shouldn't kid ourselves that this is a smart way of doing foreign policy, because I don't think it works to do foreign policy that way. Apart from anything else, I don't think recipients tend in the end to be all that grateful for it, because recipients tend not to be grateful for charity. That's one of the peculiarities of human nature. And I think, for that reason, I think Australia is mistaken in placing the emphasis on aid that it does in its relationship with Indonesia. Not to say that it doesn't have a place at all. So I would like to see that run down. The way I would like to spend the money, instead of sending Australian experts and capital to Indonesia to tell them how to do things, I'd like to send Australians to Indonesia to learn about Indonesia. I think it's a much better way of Australia investing money in the future relationship with Indonesia. Is instead of going there to tell them stuff, we should go there to listen and learn, including learn Bahasa, as I failed to do. And I think, I think in the long run, historians are going to judge that the remarkable flare in spike in aid expenditure, not just in Australia but in some other Western countries, right at the end of the era in which the West had a decisive economic advantage, is going to be seen as a kind of a psychological reaction to our declining economic advantage. You know, the candle flares brightest just before it dies.